Welcome to Soulfire Wisdom with Kate Olson. As an evolving spirit and change adventure navigator, it is Kate's mission to empower and guide you on your path and inspire your truest passions. She will encourage you to share your gifts, speak your truth, and ignite your inner wisdom and purpose. She hopes to do so with a little humor and grace and her own soulfire passion. Kate talks with amazing guests who have embraced the pursuit and are fanning the flames of their own passion, purpose, and soulfire wisdom. Now here's your host, Kate.
Good afternoon. So I'm here in Seattle and saying a little prayer that it stops snowing and that it doesn't stick, because I've totally had enough of winter. And I believed that groundhog the day before. So, I'm hoping for that early spring. So if this is your first time listening, I'm a hypnotherapist, a life coach, an NLP practitioner, and a Reiki master. But I like to call myself a change adventure navigator because I love guiding clients through obstacles and adversity to find their path, purpose, and peace. And so today is totally awesome. Try something new and talk about it Tuesday. So what I tried this week was, I think everybody's heard about the effects of environmental toxins, both on our, home environments and on the, environment in general. And one of the biggest contributors to that is the, products that we use in our homes for, cleaning and, just everyday keeping our house the way we want it. But there are actually natural products, actually things that you can make at home that don't include all the chemicals and toxins and will, give you a safer home environment. So I have never done that. So I decided that I would make my own cleaning products this week. And I actually read an article that gave you 11 different products that you could make and use for different things. I only tried 2 of them. I tried the tile and wood floor cleaner, and you make that with white vinegar, water, and then if you have one of those spray mops or a bucket and a cloth, that's really all you need. I added some lemon essential oils to get rid of the vinegar smell, but you use a cup of white vinegar to a gallon of water. And my spray mop, the reservoir doesn't work, so I used a spray bottle along with my mop, and it worked great. It worked just as good as, the floor cleaning products that I buy at the store, except that it didn't leave the streaks that those products leave. So it was actually better. So I'm glad I tried that, and I'm going to try some of the other products. And if you would like that article with the 11 different products that you can make, just send an email to soulfirewisdom@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to send that to you. So we have a great show planned for today. My guest is Cindy Gross, and we're going to be talking about workplace harassment and discrimination. So Cindy is a community leader and the founder of Befriending Dragons. She nurtures cultures where all women can thrive and belong. Her current focus is to create healing paths for women who face workplace bullies and harassers. Cindy has met many scary dragons in her life: breast cancer, divorce, layoff, changing roles and technologies, workplace harassment as a woman in the tech industry, constant striving to meet some impossible bars for success, and the idea that we always have to put work first. Most recently, she left the corporate world to strike out on her own into a community filled with people who create justice, meaning, allies, dreams, and empowerment. Each time she steps back and looks at past situations from a different angle, she befriends another dragon, learns how to make it a part of her story, and takes only the part she needs forwards to the next stage of her life. That's what Befriending Dragons is all about, taking those scary things and blending the best lessons into our lives. Then we can respond in the way we need to, and the way that leads us to healing. So now I'm going to introduce Cindy. Hi, Cindy.
Hello. Thanks for having me today.
How are you today?
Great, great. It was fun watching the snow earlier as it fell on the ground and covered the trees and the grass. It was really pretty.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping it stops where I am as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about your background and what brought you to your current path?
So I spent several decades in the technology world, 18 years at Microsoft most recently. And I was, by many measures, very successful. I was able to become a leader in the data world, the cloud world. I helped people, both my coworkers and customers, move from on-premises solutions to the cloud, from traditional data systems to big data and distributed systems. And I look at those as early trainings for me in how to reframe discussions or take things that people thought were the scary dragons that they had to fight or that they had to run from and make them something that you can embrace. So a lot of people, for example, had difficulty with the thought of losing control and what they thought was a loss of security and moving their computer systems from servers that they completely controlled into servers in the cloud. And a lot of what I did in that area was mapping out not just the technologies, but the people roles and how that would change over time. And I think that's when I started to really focus more on the relationships involved in the technology and driving change in technology than on the technology itself. And then as I faced more and more bias at work and was more aware of it, more than that it occurred more often, just that I knew that it was happening and stopped denying it, I also faced harassment. And that harassment, when I finally reported it, was what made me leave the tech world. I still believe Microsoft has one of the better cultures and one of the better ways of dealing with harassment, but it's not enough. It's not something that makes an environment where women or other people more likely to be harassed or bullied, because harassment is a specific type of bullying. Those cultures just aren't very welcoming, and a lot of people leave after that. So since the technology world has expressed a strong desire to be more diverse because they understand now that they will have better, stronger businesses and better business growth if they have a wider range of people working for them. I think now is the time to step in and really look at those diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that all these tech companies are doing and add anti-bullying, anti-harassment as a foundation for those. So that's what I'm doing with Befriending Dragons.
Great. So yes, you're right. It is exactly the right time, because you know who agrees with you?
I don't know.
The Gates.
Yes.
So that's important. So can you define for us what is harassment and bullying in the workplace? Can you give us a few examples?
Yes, and that's interesting because a lot of times what I find is people will say, well, I haven't been harassed, I haven't been bullied, I haven't seen it. And then I'll start talking about what happened to me, which was at a very high level outside of work with a coworker of a different gender than me. And when another coworker ran into us, he assumed it was somebody I'd picked up in a bar and started just saying things that shouldn't be said to anyone, let alone to a coworker. And a couple of managers observed this. And I didn't know if that was harassment. It was a year before I reported it to HR. And when I mentioned it to HR the first time, I was like, I don't know, is that harassment or not? And they're like, if it happened as you described, then absolutely 100% it violates at least Microsoft's anti-harassment policy. And when I start talking about things like that, what I've learned as I talked more and more explicitly and became more vocal about it is women come up to me and say, I don't know if I've been harassed, but this thing happened to me. And once I hear their stories, a lot of times I'm just appalled that we don't recognize the harm that we're facing as a trauma. We don't recognize it as harassment. And it really is about other people in that culture trying to express their power in ways that takes power away from us. And a lot of it is expressed in ways that overlap with things that meet a legal definition of harassment. Now, that legal definition is going to vary by state, maybe by county or city. And it's a civil, as far as I know, every state, it's not a criminal action to harass someone, it's a civil action, so it requires a lawsuit. So in order to get away from thinking of it as a legal issue, I've switched to the term bullying because it's more encompassing. And so bullying is anything that is happening. And I'm talking about adult bullying in the workplace in particular. It's something that someone else at work or a customer is doing to you to try to get you to change yourself in a way that isn't necessary for the job.
Or just to assert their power.
Or to assert their power. So they're saying, do it my way. I've like a lot of times, one gender difference in American culture is that men are taught in many different ways, lots of different reinforcement from the media to the way sports are played. The sportsmen are more likely to play than women, that just keep pushing forward, don't take no for an answer. And then they turn around and try to apply that in a couple of different ways to women and non-binary folks. So they try to push us and not accept our no's as individuals, and that leads to bullying and harassment. But they also try to coach us into being that way at work instead of saying, well, maybe that's not the best way to work together. Maybe that doesn't foster good relationships. So if you look at a whole range of activities that happen, once we start talking about it and people start telling their stories, most of the times people will come up with examples on their own, and then they'll say, I don't know, was that bullying or harassment? And I have to say, I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you whether it meets a legal definition, but I can tell you that's bullying. Yes, it is.
Yeah, sometimes you know that it is bullying and harassment, but you don't feel like you can do anything about it. Like, I had a boss who threatened to throw me down the stairs. I definitely knew that was bullying and harassment. It was a small company. I didn't feel I could really do anything about it. He also told me he got mad at me because I knocked on his door before entering his office. I was being too polite, and that showed weakness. So, okay, he doesn't want me to be too polite. So I try it his way. I try being more assertive. Does he like that? No. As a woman, I am not supposed to confront him directly. So it's a no-win situation.
Right.
Because he's a bully.
Yeah, and there's lots of situations, and the way to look at this is not that other people are doing it, it's to look at it as we are all doing it. I used to coach women to play the game as it existed. Stop saying sorry so much, be more assertive, talk over other people. And I was bullying them. I was trying to get them to be less authentic, come to work as someone other than themselves, because that's what I had been taught and what I had done to survive at work. And I wasn't thriving at work. I wasn't being the best that I could be. I wasn't bringing my best self. I was simply surviving at work because of that advice. And I turned around and tried to give that advice to other people as well. And so we have to start internally with how we act and how we make decisions about when to play the game as it exists and when to change the game. And right now I've stepped back and I said, I want to change the game instead of playing the game.
Right. So that leads into the next question, which is, how does harassment and bullying take away your voice? And more importantly, how does it cause trauma?
So I didn't make the connection to trauma for a really long time. And I had been talking to my therapist about different things that were going on in my life. And when I brought up the incident the one I reported, in retrospect, there were many other incidents of harassment, but the one I actually reported, and she just flat out told me that was harassment, that was sexism, and that was trauma. And I was, what do you mean? How is that trauma? And then since then, we've worked back through how it put me back in a spot where I reacted in a way I had learned to survive prior traumas. So I had some abuse in my past, and I had learned to deal with that by ignoring the problem, by freezing. A lot of people know the fight or flight terminology, but it's actually fight, flight, or freeze. There have always been three different things. Women and or anybody who has been abused or experienced trauma in the past might be more likely to do the freeze option. And then we blame ourselves for doing that. And other people blame us. This is a way that I know that I've bullied other people when I've said, well, when that happened, I would have punched him. I would have stepped in. I would have done that. And that's a way of saying, well, your freeze reaction wasn't valid. And the reason it's a trauma is because it does, when this new trauma, this new harassment happens, it puts us back in that earlier response that we learned to survive. It takes a lot of our energy and it keeps us from moving forward. It gets us stuck in the past. And those are all ways that trauma affects us. And trauma informed is something that's becoming somewhat of a buzzword across psychology and wellness groups nowadays. And it's at an interesting point because it's something everybody wants to do and be, but the knowledge of it is not necessarily as widespread as it could be. And so as we're learning more and more about what trauma is, there are experts out there who know it very well, and the rest of us are trying to catch up. So when we are put in that situation where we're thrown off balance, that is a trauma in our lives. And when we think about PTSD, it is something that happens, like a situation will happen to a group of people, for example, in combat is probably the most common way we think about it. Some of the people in that situation will have PTSD and some will not. And for a long time, they couldn't figure out why. And now they know it's because the people who were affected by it in ways that were really damaging and that we call or group into PTSD were people who'd had prior traumas in their life. They'd had prior abuse or prior situations that they had never learned to deal with. And so the way you get past the trauma is learning to deal with that situation.
Yes. So the tech industry is considered progressive in many ways, and you mentioned this earlier, and yet it still seems to be a strong culture for harassment and bullying, similar to a lot of other industries, but maybe, surprising because of its, progressiveness in some other areas. So why do you think this is?
I think there's a couple things. Any industry that is dominated by one particular group is going to tend to have the behaviors encoded or embedded in that society of that group. And there was a switch from women being most of the software engineers to men being most of the software engineers many decades ago. And it also switched from originally a lot of the programmers were Black women, and it became a very white male dominated industry. So you have this monoculture where everybody is expected to act and look like the leaders in the group. And some of the things that are specific to tech, one of them is hyper rationality. So one of the reasons people are attracted to tech, one of the reasons I went into it originally, was it was really logical. You know, you could be Spock from Star Trek by going into the technology industry. And that meant leaving all your emotions aside. Now, if anybody has watched the original Star Trek series, you know that every time Spock tried to leave his emotions aside, disaster happened. And yet that's exactly what we do in the tech industry. So we have a situation where, in order to leave that emotion aside, we're ignoring how we're affecting other people around us. We're ignoring all of the things that would help build good relationships and saying, well, if you do that, you must not be a good coder, you must not be a good technologist because you are good with people. And these are literally things I've heard both in the hiring phase of things and in, you know, just talking about other people on the team. Another one is a belief in meritocracy. So there's studies that show that the more a company or an industry believes that everything is done based on merit, the less likely they are to actually promote on merit. So the more you believe you're doing everything because somebody deserves it, therefore they got the reward, the more you believe that, the less likely you are to actually be doing that. And this is reflected in the numbers. So we can't get past 17 to 20% women. We can't get past around 30 to 5% Black people in technology. And a lot of that is because we already believe we're being fair. We refuse to take feedback on the places where we're not being fair, where we're enforcing a culture that isn't necessarily how things, we're not looking for the skills that get something done. We're looking for the skills we're familiar with, or the skills that look like us, or the skills that look like a prior leader, and not recognizing there might be 100 other ways to do that.
Okay. So what does it mean to reclaim your voice, and how are you, going about that in your life?
A lot of it's just about speaking up. When I was harassed, I had a short discussion with the person that was with me when we were harassed. And the next day I did talk to my boss about it. I talked to a handful of other people, and there was clearly a pushback. Well, the guy who harassed you didn't mean it. You can't take him too seriously. Everybody already knew that he was mean to everybody anyway. He wasn't any more mean to you than anyone else. And so I shut up and I stopped talking about it. And more importantly, in retrospect, my performance suffered. So I started trying to respond to external factors to try to reach some metrics so I could get out of there. But I didn't want to leave on a low note. I wanted to leave on a high note. And I started letting other people define what that high note was. I let other people define what I needed to do. And then I was never going to be successful at that because it was no longer my natural path. It was no longer my way forward. So I completely gave up my ability to act on my own interest, to act in a way that I wanted to. And I didn't talk about it. And as I started talking out about it after I reported it to HR, I started talking on a panel outside of Microsoft, and then a panel inside of Microsoft, and then to my team. I stood up at an all-hands meeting of maybe 100 people, and to give an update on the diversity efforts on our team. And I just casually said, and when I was harassed, and I was surrounded after that meeting by 5 or 6 people who came up to me to tell me their stories. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started regaining or reclaiming my voice and started talking about it. And that's when I got me back. That's when I stopped trying to meet other people's standards, or started that path. It's been a multi-year path. But reclaiming my voice is also about just getting back in touch with me and who I am and what I want, instead of letting other people drive everything.
And realizing that it's okay to be you.
Yes.
So what are some of the ways that harassers and bullies act and they get away with it?
So a lot of it has to do with, I didn't mean it, you took it the wrong way, it was just a joke.
You're being too sensitive.
You're being too sensitive, grow a thicker skin. Actually, on my very last day at Microsoft, I was in a meeting with a bunch of women, and we had gotten in a room with the 3 directors from our team 2 men and a woman. All the people giving feedback were women. And one of the brown women in the room made a comment about something that had been said to her. And one of the male directors said, "You need to grow a thicker skin." And the other 2 directors turned to him and said, "That's not an acceptable comment. We'll talk about why later." And that, to me, it was very disheartening that in this day and age, somebody still thought they could say, you need to get better at putting up with harassment, instead of saying, we'll stop doing the harassing, or we'll talk to the person who said that to you. And it was also very heartening in the fact that the other 2 leaders in the room knew enough to correct their peer and say, we're not going to tolerate this going forward. By that point, though, because I had not dealt with the trauma from the harassment, that was when I went on leave for 6 months for depression related to reporting the harassment. I don't know that it was really due to the harassment itself. It was due to my experience with reporting it. The person who harassed me, as far as I know, is still there. Last time I looked, he definitely did not leave immediately after HR found that he had violated the anti-harassment policy. I went and talked to lawyers. That is also very, that can make you lose your voice again.
An experience all in itself, yes.
Right. Yes, going to a lawyer. And one of the things I want to get away from is the immediate reaction of almost everyone when I talk about this is, did you talk to a lawyer and did you win a lawsuit? And people think you get millions of dollars out of this. The average settlement is 1 month's salary for this sort of situation. And that's not much when you think about you're leaving with depression. You've probably got to pay for a therapist. A month to move to a new tech job with no preparation is not enough time. You're going to lose money. You're not making a lot of money by going to a lawyer. And you have to sign a confidentiality agreement if you want a settlement. And if you want to go to court, it's going to take 3 to 5 years. And you're going to be raked over the coals. Every bad thing you've done in your entire career will come up in court. If you decide to take the settlement, you have to say, or at least the way the default boilerplate for Microsoft was, you will not say basically anything bad about anything that happened to you in the last 18 years at Microsoft. And by the way, not only are you going to say that you're never going to apply for a job or accept a job at Microsoft again, but upon questioning, I found out that that meant a lot of contract jobs that were working directly with Microsoft were also not available to me. And it's still unclear what would happen if I went to, say, a startup and that startup was bought by Microsoft. And so it just like shuts a lot of doors when you go to a lawyer. And again, you're shut up and you lose your voice. And I want to pivot the conversation around harassment away from lawyers and money and into, let's heal ourselves. Let's accept that trauma happened. We need to get wellness and coaching and massages and pedicures and things that make us feel good and get on with our lives.
Well, that, and realizing that, you need to stand up and be empowered. I mean, not just, okay, you are the victim and then you heal, but we need to move the conversation to where we're not the victim anymore.
Right. Yeah. And we've been encouraged by these confidentiality agreements, by culture, to not say anything. And I was harassed before the Me Too movement really kicked off a couple of years ago. And I understand it may be somewhat different now, but from talking to people that are still in these large tech companies, it hasn't changed that much. People are still afraid to speak up. They are pushing back a lot more. I'm really proud of some of the stories that I'm hearing from women that are still there. And I say women, it's not only women and non-binary people, but it is disproportionately women and even more women of color who face the harassment because it's a power problem. And people see women as weaker. They see women of color as even weaker than white women. And so there's more of a feeling that it's okay to bully people with less power.
Yes, and one thing that really shocked me and made me sad, I guess, was, okay, one of the reasons why I'm having Cindy on is because I previously worked in the tech industry, and I faced bullying and harassment both in that industry and in other industries that I worked in. And one of the things that I encountered was I worked in the tech industry, and then I worked for an association that served the tech industry. And in that association, it was mostly women who were running the association, but they were running it like men. They had all come from the tech industry, and they were doing the same bullying and harassment that they had been subjected to when they worked in that industry. And they had learned that that was what you needed to do to be successful. And, you know, it wasn't the way that they probably would have been if they had felt, you know, empowered to act, you know, like themselves, use their own voice. They were replicating that same behavior.
Yeah, and I see that a lot with a lot of the successful women or people of color of any gender who were successful at Microsoft, that a lot of them had to do at least some amount of acting like a white man in order to get to the point where they then felt they were free to act like a woman. And, you know, I think about the woman who made a point of telling every peer and every boss and every direct report that they needed to have a box of Kleenex in their office because she was going to cry. There were instances where maybe a man might get mad and start yelling, but she would cry in those situations, and she was just telling everybody this is normal. She wouldn't have been able to do that if she hadn't first played the game as a man and gotten to the point of power where she could say that. And so there are women who are able to maintain that sense of authenticity. But even in that case, most of the examples I've seen, at least, they had to act like a white man at some point in order to get to that point where they could start doing small expressions of power. And I think that's where we have to really shift it, is to change that culture to begin with. We know that if you look at companies that have switched over to having really diverse boards, racially diverse boards outperform the least racially diverse boards by 30-some%. And for gender gaps, companies that have a lot of women in leadership outperform the monocultures of all men by around 17%. So there's a clear business advantage to having a wide variety of lived experiences. And lived experiences are very different in most cases based on our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, our gender identity. So we need to bring those people into the room and make sure they're actually able to contribute to the decisions, that they are making the decisions, not just in the room, not there for a photo opportunity, not there to say, hey, we met some number that we made up, but there to actually change the direction of the project or the team, or preferably the entire company, and point us in new directions. And that's where the growth will come from. A lot of tech companies right now are doing the same work as other companies. The growth is in undiscovered opportunities that are going to come from people who have not previously been able to say, hey, here's something we can do. Here's something my community and my lived experience says is a gap that hasn't been filled. So when we bring in others, people who don't look like current leadership, we're really opening up huge areas of growth.
Yes, and one thing that, has been sort of overlooked is forever, men have used those different and softer skills of women to their own benefit. They have used, the way women can finesse things and negotiate without giving them credit.
Yes.
They use those skills because they don't have them themselves, to get what they want, and then they take credit for it.
Right. And that's a double-edged sword, because men who try to develop those skills are often punished in all sorts of ways. They're made fun of. They may not be chosen for leadership positions if they do exhibit those sort of skills. So the only way in some cases that they can get ahead is to use those skills and say, well, these are useless skills. The women who are able to do these things, we're not going to pay them very much. But they're going to use them. They're going to take advantage of these skills that women are encouraged to develop because we're rewarded to have them. And then they're going to take all the credit for it. And that's not necessarily the fault. It's usually not the fault of the individual people. It's the way our society works.
Yes,
And
our society has been, kind of set up that way. I mean, admittedly, they say things like behind every man there's a woman. Well, that behind part instead of alongside, So why is it important to be intersectional, to hold as true the seemingly contradictory ideas that everyone is unique and everyone is a product of our cultures and our systems?
So we are all unique, and part of that uniqueness is based on our racial identity, our gender identity, all of these different aspects of our community. The term intersectional was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in particular for Black women, because there was a lawsuit where a Black woman sued and said she had been discriminated against. And the courts looked at it and said, well, Black men at your company, because there were no other Black women in that role, the Black men didn't face this problem and other women didn't face that problem. So it must have been you. It must have been a problem with you. It wasn't a problem of your race or your gender. But the fact is, we do treat Black women differently than white women. We do treat Black women differently than Black men as a society. We have different stereotypes. If you think about who is cast for a role in a TV show or a movie, we're still surprised when a Black woman shows up as the leader as opposed to the second in command. We're still surprised when a woman is cast as president in a TV role. So we have all of these deeply ingrained things that we expect from people. So these stereotypes, the biases that we have built in that we don't even recognize, those are things where we have to think about a Black trans woman and a white trans man are treated differently. And so you can't just look at one aspect. And a lot of diversity efforts are built around one thing. The tech industry in particular is really great at helping white women. I, as a white woman, feel like I lost opportunities because I wasn't a man. I had way more opportunities than any woman of color at Microsoft, I guarantee you. And the fact that an individual Black woman or Asian woman or whatever identity made it ahead occasionally doesn't outweigh the problem that we just don't look at a lot of people as being capable of being leaders. We put them in buckets of, well, we're not even going to consider you. And if you do, well, you're the only one. So if we're intersectional, we look at, all right, we've got this thing we're going to change, this program or this change in process or whatever it is that we're going to move forward. We need to think about, how is that going to affect people from different intersecting groups, not just women, because that will almost always be the majority racial group of women in that company, not just, for example, LGBTQ, because that almost always favors gay and lesbian people, leaves out bisexual and transgender people, for example. So we need to really be intersectional about how we approach any changes that we make and make sure we're not harming or leaving behind an already marginalized group for the benefit of a different marginalized group.
That is true, and that is a problem that we need to work on, and difficult because it's really a complex and hard to balance. What can others in the workplace do to help in changing this overall culture that we have around, I guess, just total workplace relationships and, how to make it all work?
when we see something that we recognize as bullying, we need to center the person who is harmed and not the person doing the harm. An example of that would be if you see somebody, say on the subway, this is an easier example outside of work, and you see somebody yelling at someone with religious or racial things being said about them or sexualized, don't yell at that person who's doing the harassing and tell them to stop. Instead, go sit down next to the person that is being harassed and say, "Oh my goodness, I'm so glad I got to see you. I know we were going to meet up later for a drink, but why don't we go now?" Or something like that. Like imply you already know them, give them a safety net, take them out of the situation. Don't go and fight the person who was doing the bad thing, but actually help the person who was harmed. And so when you're looking at an environment at work and you see somebody that you feel like they're being mistreated in some way, think about how can you help that person as opposed to centering the person who's doing the harm. Now, there are things we need to go and coach that person who's doing harm. We need to do other things, but at least in the moment, we need to help the person who's experiencing the harm, help them get settled back into a sense of themselves, a sense that they have some set of control, and a sense that they're safe. Take them out of that fight, flight, or freeze as our first priority.
Yeah.
And then we can look at ways that we can help longer term. Like I had a meeting that I was going to weekly, and I was constantly being interrupted by one person. It was a phone call. None of us were in person. And I got on the phone with one of my coworkers afterwards, and he said, "I don't understand why that guy is always interrupting you." And so I educated him on this happens a lot for women. Other people of any gender tend to interrupt women way more than they interrupt men. And when women speak, about 30% of the time, they're seen as dominating a meeting. And so after that, after I'd educated him on that, and I said, "Hey, would you be willing to speak up?" And every meeting after that, when somebody interrupted me, he would say, "Hey, I want to hear what Cindy had to say. Let her finish." And eventually the other person stopped interrupting me all the time and waited because they had learned that my friend was always going to jump in on my behalf.
Yes,
So,
that's a technique that if you take the stage away from the bully, then they'll usually stop, at least for that, for that occasion.
right.
So we're almost out of time. If you could leave the listeners with one takeaway from today's show, what would you want that to be?
Don't minimize the trauma that happens. When you feel bad, when you feel like something just isn't right, believe yourself. Don't gaslight yourself. You matter. Your feelings matter. Be the star of your own life. Take control. And even if you can't respond in that moment, don't feel bad about yourself because of what somebody else did. Take the time to grieve, to heal, to talk to professionals or your friends, and really center yourself and your feelings and believe yourself.
Yes. And even if, the situation doesn't turn out the way you wanted it to, because a lot of times it won't, you're going to feel better about, how you reacted and have less trauma if you, stay true to yourself.
Yes.
So thank you so much for being here today, Cindy, and talking about this. It's an important topic, and I know, when I heard that you were doing this, I totally thought, oh, that is so needed. So thank you. And I'd like to thank the listeners for listening today. And carry this thought with you through your week. Workplace bullying. If you don't step in, you're supporting it. And that was said by yourlifemattersempowerment.org. So we all need to do something about it. So be sure to tune in next week. We have another great show planned in honor of Valentine's Day. I'll be talking with Lisa Lee. And Lisa is a real estate broker, but more importantly, she's a dating blogger and someone who is in the dating world. She's actually going out there and putting herself out and dating. And we're just going to have a down-to-earth conversation about dating and all the, joys and obstacles encountered in the dating process. So tune in next Tuesday. That'll be February 11th at 3 p.m. and we'll talk about dating. So I'm just going to say goodbye for now, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to Soul Fire Wisdom with Kate Olson. We hope you enjoyed the show. If we made you laugh, brightened your day, or sparked a new thought, we have succeeded in our mission. Join us next time when we'll share more secrets and truths and all the magic of transformation that is the journey to Soul Fire Wisdom. Always remember, be fierce in the pursuit of what sets your soul on fire.